I think we got most people. Go ahead.
Yeah, do you want me to go? Hello. Am I on? It sounds like I'm on. All right. Everybody take your seat and we'll get rolling here. I know people will get fidgety once we get closer to lunch, so we'll keep ourselves moving. Thanks for coming back and being here today. It's always great for me to be up here as an alumni of the University of Colorado and with my former professor on this panel. It's great as well, Lakshman. So this panel is about social entrepreneurs and impact investing. I have a 9-week-old baby, and so my preparation for this was laying on my back with him on my chest last night, trying to figure out why I was qualified to lead this panel. And so I sat down and just kind of thought about all the things I've been involved in that would kind of qualify me as calling myself a social entrepreneur. And I kind of went through all these different things that I've done. So I started an organization called Elephant Energy, as some of you know, that sells small-scale solar products in Southern Africa and on the Navajo Nation. We're a nonprofit, but we sell things. So I always saw myself as a social entrepreneur doing that work, even though it wasn't kind of a for-profit, perhaps typically what you'd think of as a social entrepreneur. I've also started a spin-off that is a for-profit that actually builds those solar-powered lights and kind of tries to integrate pay-as-you-go solar technology into them. So that's kind of more of a situation where we have an investor and a return is expected, or at least money is expected back in his pocket. And as well, right now, I'm the executive director of the Posner Center for International Development. So for those of you that haven't been, we're a 25,000 square foot space down in Denver. That is basically the home of the majority of the international development community here in Colorado. We have 55 tenants that work all over the world, doing everything you can possibly think of. So working on small-scale agriculture, building bridges, putting in water wells, developing apps to help people get goods to market or to help kind of institutionalize health records, everything you can possibly think of. So if you do international things and you haven't been to the Posner Center, you should definitely come. We are kind of the place to be for that type of thing these days. And so I was sitting down and kind of thinking about all these different things that I've done and trying to kind of put them in different holes. I mean, they're all very different. They get money in different ways. They've grown themselves in different ways, and started to kind of think about, what impact investing and social entrepreneurship was. And so to kind of get people's blood flowing a little bit, I wanted to try a little experiment this morning. So as a start, can everybody maybe raise one hand just to see if everybody's hands work here? All right, we're doing well. So I wanted to just kind of run through a list of kind of attributes of perhaps companies or ventures that might be running. And I want you to raise your hand if you think, or if you would say this is a social venture, or if somebody was investing in this company, you would think of them as an impact investor. So, number one, a business selling cook stoves in Africa with a goal to stop death from smoke inhalation. Is that a social venture? All right. How about the same business with an investor behind the scenes that's getting a 5 times return from investing in that company? How about a nonprofit organization selling cook stoves at a subsidized rate? How about a government utility installing solar in homes and charging customers by unit or for use by unit? How about a nonprofit training entrepreneurs to sell cook stoves but funded by donor funds? How about a multinational oil company that employs 10,000 people in a country with 80% unemployment? How about a cell phone company that operates a network in rural Africa? How about Google? So I think, in thinking about this and in thinking about, in my point of view, what social entrepreneurs and impact investors are, I kind of came down to the idea that really their main motivation, even though they might be pursuing a profit or really are using kind of business techniques to run their organization or business, but their main motivation is this social mission. So Elephant Energy, my organization, or Divvy, the spinoff, or the Posner Center, where we rent space to people down in Denver. The main mission is this kind of social mission, not necessarily to make money. And what we do is we use business techniques to help us do that, because business in general works, and business, if you do it right, is sustainable and can run for the long term. And so that really is what this panel is here today to talk about. And all of you are engaged in social entrepreneurship or in philanthropy and all these different pieces of this in different ways. And so we can kind of explore all these different ways that we can think about how you run sustainable businesses and how we actually have an impact with these types of businesses. So I'm going to quickly go through and say who's on this panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to give their own introductions. You can read their backgrounds in the booklet. Greg Berry is with Impact Hub. He is the founder, board member, all things for the Impact Hub, sensei of the Impact Hub, perhaps. Lakshman Guruswamy over here, old professor of mine as well at the University of Colorado, and really has helped the Getchus Wilkinson Center grow here. Blake Sanders with Nocero Solar really sells solar-powered light bulbs all over the world and to people all over the world. And Nathan Hutner really works with Redstone Strategies Group here in Denver on philanthropy, a lot on kind of climate and natural resources work as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg, and he can give the background. We can go down the line, and then as we've done with last panels, or the last few panels, I'll have a few questions, and then we can turn it loose to the crowd and see where we go. Yep.
So my name is Greg Berry, and now entrepreneur in residence. I'm fortunate that in December we actually hired a new managing director, so I've been able to step out of a lot of the day-to-day of running a co-working and incubation center. And I think the real question, two real questions I'd like to touch on here in a couple minutes. One is, what is Impact Hub and what does that mean, and what is our network about? And then the other is, this question of, what does social enterprise mean, and who are the members? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the stories of the people who are doing work in our community. So Impact Hub is much like the Posner Center, is a physical space, 10,000 square feet, right in downtown Boulder. Just, we joke about the students can sort of roll right down the hill into our front door on the corner of Broadway and Walnut. And we are a space for people who are making positive change in the world to work, and we have a very broad definition of what that means. And we have people who work in energy policy and are energy investors. A lot of one of our permanent tenants does invest in large-scale, utility-scale solar projects. Other folks working in local food systems, international development. We have people who are, creatives, whether they're in technology or the arts or media, who are serving these positive change places. We have a number of coaches and those sorts of things. And, we struggle with really simple language, and we've tended to move away from the notion of labels. That person's a social entrepreneur, but that's a tech entrepreneur, and those labels tend to be pretty amorphous because we believe that ultimately it's values-based. And long before I think the language around social entrepreneurship and impact investing was created, and certainly long before anybody knew what they meant, I think there were a number of us who were very values-driven, and said that I'm going to, put a values-based frame on how I make career decisions and how I invest my own capacity, and then as we've been successful in business, how it is that we then invest resources and those sorts of things. And so I think that what you find at a place like the Impact Hub is more values alignment and less sector alignment, if you will. We're part of a global network. There are now, my last count, 66 hubs on 6 continents. And they span the gamut of positive impact work, right? The hub, and you can imagine, right? Obviously, social enterprise work in Johannesburg, very different than in Singapore, and then in London, and than in San Francisco. And so even San Francisco and Oakland have very different memberships, very different areas of focus, and very, very different themes happening, even within, just 20 miles of each other, never mind 2,000 miles. And so we find that we've got a really powerful network of change makers, and this opportunity to connect people across the areas of work that they do is the sort of emergent work of the network at this point. And we're getting, we ourselves as makers are very well connected and know each other's work and know what's happening in all these different cities. And now we're going to push that knowledge down, leverage technology and push that knowledge down and make it available for all our members. And so that's the cutting edge work. I've just been elected to the Hub Global Board, so I now know in painful detail just how challenging that actually is. The most interesting part of that work is actually how we think about translating, right? Impact, the word, just the very word impact, means a very different thing in Sao Paulo when translated into Portuguese, than it does in Seoul when translated into Korean. And so just even coming to terms with what that means for all of us and how we can all be values aligned while we're doing different kinds of work is a very interesting challenge. And we've recognized that we've got a unique localization engine for large organizations that want to be building their innovations and start to replicate. I think that we're maybe the most powerful nascent replication engine for social change and social impact. So those are the kinds of things that we really work on there. And then the other question I think is really interesting is what is social enterprise? And Doug asked the question of us previously, is it harder to be a social entrepreneur? And I think that in thinking about that, I think the answer is, the classic, yes, no, and it depends. I think yes, in the sense that if you're coming from a business mind and you're saying, well, it's already challenging managing to the bottom line, and how do we take that and then add this social and environmental responsibility to things? Well, yes, of course, it's more complicated, more things to measure, more decisions to make. My sense of it is no, when you're coming from a values-based place, you already know the right thing to do. And so your job is to make the number turn black instead of red in the bottom right corner at the end of the day, and that's the work that you do. And that's challenging no matter what it is that you do. And then it depends is really the category, right? I mean, as you mentioned, like selling LED lights in Africa, there's actually a really nice business in it. And you'll be able to speak to that. And it's actually really serving a positive impact, It's a different case when you're looking at energy investors. And it's a different case when you're looking at teaching women to read in Afghanistan. And those are all social enterprises in the broadest sense. And so each piece is different. And I think I tend to be moving away from these big labels and these big notions. Same on the impact investing side, right? There are people who are making 5x their money on solar investing. And there are people who are losing 100% of their money in philanthropic endeavors, in sub-Saharan Africa. And so all of those people are technically impact investors. And so I think moving away from these labels is my goal, and that the answer is really you have to look at the individual case and understand where models are replicable and where capital can be returned and where it really has no place in being returned. So that's my sort of quick answer on that, and I'll stop talking at this point.
Good morning. My name is Blake Sanders. I work for Nocaro Solar. We are a for-profit social enterprise based out of Denver. We actually used to reside in the Posner Center, but grew a little bit, needed some more space, so we moved down the street. What we primarily do is try to eradicate the use of kerosene around the world. So in many places in Africa and Southeast Asia, they're still heavily reliant on using this kerosene fuel, mostly for lighting and for cooking. So we offer a small-scale solar light, we call it solar light bulb technology, that can replace altogether the use of kerosene. And what we find, being a for-profit company, is that we can present value all the way down the supply chain. So not only is it viable for us to sell to a distributor or a retailer in these local countries, and they can make money off this so that it's sustainable, we also find that the product that we sell from an end consumer or user perspective creates real income. It can generate income, and there's an ROI against it. So, when you provide this lamp, someone no longer has to spend money on a daily basis for kerosene. We also offer products that can charge cell phones. So again, in most of Africa, people have cell phones, but they may not have a viable way to charge them on a consistent basis. So if you can provide them with a small-scale technology that they can afford, many times they are able to generate an additional income charging multiple people's cell phones within their village. So there's definitely a couple different approaches that we take. That's the commercial aspect. The other part of the business that we do is work with governments. So a lot of times, whether it be government tender or just a direct interaction, we are able to get that particular government entity to procure a certain amount of our lights, and then they're distributed or given away to the end consumer. So there's kind of two ways we go about it. And again, just to wrap up, what we really find is that when you have this for-profit model and you let free market economics do its work, and ultimately keep your value chain in line, again, all the way through the supply chain and eventually to the end consumer. So, I enjoy my work because we sell a product that ultimately benefits the person on the ground that may make, less than $10 a day, and, in part doesn't have to spend some of that money on kerosene lamps. So that's Nocaro Solar.
You setting your timer.
Oh, yeah, I'm setting my time. Yeah. Well,
You've been here before.
yeah, thank you so much. I'm Lakshman Guruswamy, and I just want to make a preliminary point. First is that, unlike many of you who here who are doing wonderful things on the ground, I work much more in the in the arena of ideas and concepts that might facilitate the kind of social entrepreneurship and, quite frankly, globalization of what I'm going to talk about, which is appropriate or affordable, sustainable energy technologies. Second point I want to make is that the area, the little corner of the handkerchief in which I work and others with me work, is called energy poverty. So I'm going to tell you very briefly about what this phenomenon is, and in the latter part, of the next part of my ability to talk, I'll talk to you a little bit about what I see as ways forward. So energy poverty deals with between 1.8 to 3 billion people, depending on whom you're counting, who have no access to clean, affordable energy for cooking, resulting in 3.5 to 4 million premature deaths, largely of women and children, every year. No access to lighting, and this is where I'm delighted that we have got here a representative from Nokero. I'm just bringing out a book on energy and poverty, and two of the most wonderful contributions have come first from Steve, who's the head of Nokero, and the other is from the guy who's chairing this panel, who writes about elephant energy. So lighting, the absence of lighting results in nearly 1 million deaths from different types of either ingestion of kerosene or burns. Thirdly, absence of energy for sanitation. I mean, there's like 3.5 million kids who die every year, children, for bad drinking water, and energy is required for sanitation. And finally, lack of energy for domestic burdens. We often forget the fact that among the 1.8 billion people who have no access to energy for motive power, most, these are people who are off the radar screen. The global warming people don't talk about them because they don't emit any carbon dioxide. They don't have access to energy. And these people, the brunt of the work they do, it falls on women and children. The women have to go collect the firewood to light the fires. The women and children have to go and collect the water. They have to be pounding, grinding, and it is actually a form of violence on the women in these developing, these very poor parts of the world. And that is the phenomenon of energy poverty. Now, in the 1 minute left for me, I'm going to say this, that the United Nations, and the question that Doug was wanting me to address was the international response. The United Nations has responded very wonderfully and said that we are going to provide sustainable energy for all by 2030. It is called SC for All. It's a wonderful program, but I think that is something that we should all aspire to, electricity for all. But there's a question here. It's going to cost a huge amount of money. And since the people who are going to be provided with electricity are the most desperately poor in the world, it's going to be very difficult to get to that target by 2030. So assuming it's going to be like 2040 or 2050, in the meantime, what are we going to do with these people who we call the energy poor? And our suggestion is that they should be provided with appropriate sustainable energy technologies, like solar bulbs, like the example you gave of cook stoves. It could be treadle pumps. It could be machines, mechanical devices to pound grain. It could be some kind of cheap bicycle because transportation is difficult. But the real challenge, and we call these appropriate sustainable energy technologies that are not hydrocarbon based, but are a bridge between the old Stone Age technologies and the modern technology. But the challenge here is how do we globalize it? And that is something that I shall like to talk about in the next sequence. Thank you.
So good morning. My name is Nathan Hutner from Redstone Strategy Group. We are a management consulting firm based here in Boulder with offices in California as well that serves large foundations and nonprofits, mostly in the United States, but also internationally. And so many of our clients are the foundations you might hear on NPR as you drive into work in the morning. So the Hewlett Foundation, the Packard Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and a number of others. These are foundations that many of them take a lot of pride in their strategic approach to philanthropy. So their belief is that by carefully designing grant-making strategies, they can earn what you might call an impact alpha, that they can outperform, just giving money to a really high-performing NGO and letting them do with it as they would through general operating support. And that has a lot of challenges associated with it, obviously, and that's a whole other debate for another day. But the key point for them is that impact investing is exciting, but also a little bit of a challenge to understand what quite to do with it. And so foundations, and I'm going to enter the realm of cartoon sketch here and not get into a lot of nuance, but just sketch the world quite broadly. Foundations have taken largely two approaches. So one is there's a group of foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation among them, that has argued that if you can get enough investor money excited about impact investing, then you can generate interest and investment in social goals that foundations have, but might not be perfectly aligned with these strategies that they've taken so much time in developing. And so they've invested a lot in building up the infrastructure of impact investing, creating indicators of social impact that an investor from a bank to a small nonprofit to an entrepreneur can point to and say, that's the impact I'm having, and I know how to measure it, and I can explain it to you. And fundamentally, they view their endowments as one way of leading the way in this charge, of showing how you can invest an endowment effectively. There's another side which is actually a lot older than that, which is those foundations that have been using program-related investments, which are legally defined in the tax code. If you make a program-related investment that meets those criteria, it counts towards the foundation's disbursement requirement every year, so they need to give 5% of their endowment away, and PRIs count against that. And those have been a very, I'd say, sleepy investment mechanism, so very low-interest loans frequently to nonprofits to buy land that will be conserved down the line, for example. So they front them the money, and then the Nature Conservancy or another conservancy group raises the money on the back end after to pay back the loan with 1% interest, for example. But you are starting to see program-related investments be used in somewhat more strategic and creative ways that are both more aligned with these strategies that the grant-making staff has and also more entrepreneurial in their intent. So, for example, there was a recent program-related investment to support an effort to create an organization that will buy contraceptives as a group buyer at a much lower rate and then provide those contraceptives to clinics throughout the United States that provide those contraceptives to low-income women. And so the idea is that this is a business. It's not a nonprofit. It's going to be revenue generating and profit earning, and eventually it will start producing these contraceptives as generics and do so actually immediately. And so that's very different from obviously buying land for a conservation organization to raise money around. And it has the potential to be very aligned with a grant-making strategy. The challenge going forward is that the grant makers who are designing these strategies understand grant-making really well and are used to considering the ways in which grant-making solves problems that markets can't solve. So they've really designed grant-making strategies that when markets fail, businesses fail, or government fails to address a problem, philanthropy can step in. And yet impact investing starts to blur those lines and enables them potentially to not only look at strict market failures in a way that grants can address, but also to start new businesses that, with an injection of capital, can start to operate effectively, even if it means at low returns. And I think there's a lot of interest and excitement there, which I'm happy to talk about more. But it is a challenge, and it's a growing one, I think, especially as the voices holding up impact investing grow louder. These philanthropies that have grown to really be impact-focused first are struggling to understand exactly how to balance those dual outcomes of enough profitability to get to scale and generate investor interest, and enough impact that they feel like they're not giving away the farm on their strategic goals.
I kind of want to build on that a little bit. I know, Greg, we talked about some questions beforehand, and you answered a little bit one of them just about whether kind of an entrepreneur with a social mission is more or less likely to fail than just a standard entrepreneur. I think we've always heard the statistic that 90% or 95% of entrepreneurs fail. But just to kind of build a little bit on what Nathan said as well, because you talked about that a little bit, just in terms of the financing, or as you look at the organizations and the companies that are in the Impact Hub and you look at kind of where they're getting their money, when you see these more entrepreneurial ventures looking for money from investors or perhaps from grants, do you kind of counsel them to, again, if they're for-profit and they're really trying to run these for-profit businesses, just to really stick on that line, look for investment, because there are grant opportunities out there for these types of organizations that are doing kind of this impactful work as well? And from my experience, it's always kind of a mixed bag as to whether you should go look for those big USAID grants to fund your work, because you start getting kind of funneled down this line of being able to get more and more of those grants and not being the business that you wanted to be.
Right. No, it's a fantastic challenge, and I think one of the things that's so complicated about it is it's an n-dimensional problem, right? I mean, you've got sector by sector, like what's the natural return of that particular business, right? You've also got like investor interest, and I think that to build on some of what Nathan was talking about with MRIs and PRIs, if you think of someone who's willing to give a $10 million grant, or a foundation that's willing to give a $10 million grant to an organization that's paying rent on office space, right? And they're going to get zero financial return on that grant. They could take $2 million of those dollars, they could buy the building, own the asset, get the reduced rent paid back at a 1% mortgage type of framework, right? So they're reducing the organization's rent, they're owning the asset, and now they're getting 101% return on that money instead of 0% return on that $2 million. And so we have some new innovations. So I think the funders are very interested. The other thing that we've learned, so again, it depends on the sector that they're looking at. And there are, I'll say two things that we know. First of all, if you're talking about for-profit entities that have a really strong social mission, at the end of the day, you've still got to be able to be at least financially break even to even deliver the social impact that you have as a goal in the first place, right? If you're not extant, and if you can't just keep raising Series B and Series C and Series D, and sooner or later, even the most warm-hearted investors are going to get tired of not seeing the returns that you've promised. So you've got to really be able to focus on that level of execution and really run a successful, strong, tight, ultimately profit-making business. And the other thing that we're learning, and especially in the case of the hub and in many businesses, is the dividend may not be financial, right? The dividend may be experiential, and the dividend may be, in the case of high net worth individuals, maybe cocktail party dividend, right? Where they can say, well, I've invested in this project in Bangladesh and I got to go and, and so those are very real, non-financial, capitalizable benefits and effectively dividends. And so I think that there are social capital dividends that are very clear, new networks and available. We have definitely seen investors in the hub who met other investors in the hub who've been able to then co-invest in businesses together, right? Which has turned out to be more lucrative than their returns that we're delivering them. And so I think it adds that n-dimensionality to it. So it makes the answer yes or no harder to answer because it depends on the actual details and the nuance of the question.
Sure. Blake, I know obviously Nocaro is running a business and has revenue and needs to make sure it can pay its staff. So how do you balance the fact that you are trying to grow this business with the idea that you have this social mission? Obviously you want to get as many of these solar light bulbs out there as possible, but what is that balance? I mean, you could obviously sell them for less or hand out a bunch of these bulbs and kind of have an impact in that way as well. What is that balance between kind of your social mission and the fact that you want to grow and expand?
Sure. Well, firstly, I think that, we try to benchmark our technology from a price standpoint on what else is available in the market, but also this, ROI concept against kerosene lamps. So ultimately, what we try to do is make our product on the ground available for a price that, against kerosene can have a potential ROI of about a month. So that's one way we really look to balance it, but it can be very challenging because our margins aren't necessarily as high if we were to try to push these products through North America or Western Europe, where that market can bear a higher price point. So you do take kind of a hit in terms of margin, but again, the real purpose of the company isn't necessarily to make a high profit. It is to provide a tangible social impact around the world in areas where you can introduce a small-scale technology that dramatically improves someone's life. So it's kind of a tough thing to do, and Greg hit on a point with some of our competitors will go through several stages of funding. They may be on Series D or even longer down the line of their funding, and eventually that may run out. So what we try to do is really focus on organic growth. We don't take in a whole lot of investment unless it's just, it's the right partner at the right time with the right dollar amount. But we try to build our commercial business so that we can, organically grow and supply the products throughout the supply chain and, build through that mechanism. And then, when we can, we do work with governments, whether that be USAID, DFID, UNHCR, but we find that those are very difficult channels to network within. So, of course, we try, but, there's a lot of competition for these funds around the world. So, you have to kind of hedge your bets, so to speak, and pursue a number of different things. So ultimately, that's commercial, government, and then just the government USAID sector, I would call it, is what we really try to pursue. So a lot of it is just kind of looking at what your target end consumer can afford, and then stepping back from there. So a bottoms-up approach.
Lakshman, you've had a lot of experience, obviously, working internationally and working with these international institutions and governments, and you mentioned the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. How are these kind of government institutions and even universities like this helping companies like Nocaro or helping the entrepreneurs that Greg works with? How are they kind of pushing that ball forward, and how can they do it better, I guess, in the future as well?
Well, thank you. Well, the first thing is that the area that I occupy, I'm situated in the area in the realm of ideas and thoughts that might facilitate what you guys are doing. I've learned so much already from what you guys are doing on the ground. But I just want to stress that there is a vision about where we are going with this. And in order to provide affordable, sustainable energy technologies, whether it be solar bulbs, or whether it be cook stoves, or whether it be treadle pumps, it's important to keep in mind that these are commodities, goods that are being marketed in the poorest parts of the world, and you have stressed some of the challenges of doing so. My thought here is that from a macro perspective, if you are trying to market anything, and I think the idea of hubs is great, but you are dealing with different types of entities who want to serve this need. You're dealing with designers, you're dealing with people who fabricate goods, you're dealing with funding, obviously, you're dealing with marketing, you're dealing with employment, and you're dealing with cultural adoption of these technologies by the people at whom you're aiming. And so it would seem that one thing that we could do in the realm of ideas is to, and the United Nations has not quite come down to doing that, but I think it's possible for maybe the Wilkinson Center or other entities to create, and maybe you guys can do this, create, coalitions or hubs, which is a form of horizontal integration, if you can call it, which brings together these different designers. And then one of the objectives of such ventures should be, and I'm now wearing a hat as an environmentalist as well, is to understand and flag the life cycle of an asset. From its conception through design and manufacture to marketing services, impacts both positive and negative, and its final disposal. Where possible, this requires tracking and tracing the product chain of each asset. Secondly, when such a hub or a coalition has been established, it faces the crucial question, which you guys are on the ground battling with, how to promote viable business enterprises that design, manufacture, market, and deploy assets. Now, entrepreneurs in the developing world, as you well know, who wish to set up their enterprises in developing countries face a host of daunting economic, political and regulatory risk, which you've just mentioned, not encountered in developed countries. Even though flourishing entrepreneurships may be the key to the success of assets, the challenge and premises of entrepreneurship in developing countries, I don't think has been properly explored, and you're doing it now. Now, there are a number of questions pertaining to the kind of asset enterprise, that's affordable, sustainable energy enterprise, that will best promote sustainable development among the energy poor. So, to what extent should we be looking, and I'm raising this provocatively, at medium to larger growth-oriented enterprises rather than micro-enterprises? Most of the specialist research that I have seen, and I don't profess to know too much about this, has concentrated on micro-enterprises and low-growth lifestyle businesses. Traditionally, micro-firms' impact on the larger population, purchasing inclinations have not been significant. You know, micro-firms are good and great talking points and, you know, good cocktail chatter, but they haven't had a major impact. Large-scale product adoption usually is dependent on successful marketing strategies and reasonable product price points, which traditionally have not been a strength of micro-firms. It has been suggested these micro-firms do not contribute in a meaningful way to the sustainable economic growth needed to reduce poverty among the least developed countries in the world. So maybe there's something to be said for new and growth-oriented firms, more likely to contribute to economic growth and provide important new sources of high-quality employment. Now, in order to be more positive, and I want to close with that, we have to be sensitive to the cultural milieu in which these firms are operating. Admittedly, most of the asset enterprises in developing countries will function, this we often forget, in economies still dominated, the ones that I work with, the 49 least developed countries in the world, the Swedes of India, you know, landlocked Asia, in subsistence agricultural economies, and which rely heavily on labor and natural resources, in contrast to the technological and financial innovation that is the culture in which we move. And I'll end up with just this, that in order to deal with this, you know, and you know more about this, startup capital, private-owned local enterprises, particularly in Asia, have been more innovative and enterprising than wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign firms and whole promise to promoting assets. This statement underscores the importance of small businesses. However, there are huge survival odds, as you mentioned. The ones I saw was that in the first 5 years, the survival rate is less than 50%. And so the absence of financial innovation, which you guys are addressing, is something we have to take account of. The second is internal financing. In many of the financing of small and medium enterprises, much of the capital has come from savings and micro-lending through families. And we've got to try and get past it. And finally, the enterprise needs to obtain early-stage financing. There is a scarcity of external risk capital financing because of the low rate of return. But these are some of the problems that we need to face up to in terms of how we might move forward with the kind of social entrepreneurship that could address the real problems of the least developed energy poor people of the world.
Ethan, kind of building on something that Greg said about, you know, the funding coming from foundations and philanthropies and, you know, possibly the better business impact that they could have. How are foundations shifting, or what could foundations in that community do better to kind of get more into this world? I mean, I've been involved with Rockefeller a little bit, and there's a lot of talk about impact investing, but still this kind of flow of funds is still a lot towards this kind of grant-based mentality. So where are we going there, and you know, kind of what are the next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a rife area of conversation. I think the challenge, there are really prosaic institutional challenges at play here, which is just that for lots of reasons, the folks who manage endowments are kept very separate from the folks who manage grant making. And so getting the two to talk in meaningful ways is tricky. And when foundations have, for example, created program-related investment funds, some of the rules around those funds have really encouraged very particular ways of operating. So for example, they may say, you've got $200 million in total to play with in this portfolio. You lose money on that portfolio, and it may not be strictly gone, but we're not really telling you what happens next. There may not be another reinjection of capital. You earn more than your $200 million, and that'll go back into the endowment. So there's very little incentive for the people who manage those portfolios, first of all, to take on a lot of risk, and also to take on risk that might return, since it may be that what they'd really like to do is smooth over time the fact that they're earning 20% on an investment this year, but that's going to be necessary to make up for the fact that they're losing 20% across a few investments next year, and there just aren't the means to do that. So there's these really intense institutional barriers that we shouldn't minimize, that the foundation world is starting to work through. I also think it's worth thinking about, and this is widening the conversation substantially, but I think it's just been interesting to listen to the panel, and especially when talking about how to create businesses that serve the very poor. We're talking a lot about how to inject capital into those businesses, and yet these economies are cash poor economies, and maybe what's needed to make impact investing successful is just a wealth transfer from into these economies. So there's a lot of excitement about the idea of unconditional cash transfers, for example, as a development mechanism. And not to put myself out of a job, but if more foundations did things like that, you might find it a lot easier to then create businesses to serve those economies, rather than putting in a lot of effort to pump a dry well. Not that these people aren't productive or hardworking, they just don't have cash to pay the investors back. So I think there's a way in which there are really prosaic institutional barriers at work that I think foundations, if they can address them, find ways of making their grant makers understand the ways in which investments and businesses, and not just nonprofit organizations, can complement their grant making strategies, and helping investment managers and boards of directors understand the ways in which the structure of their internal investment rules affect what they do, but also larger questions about what the role of philanthropy is alongside a growing social entrepreneurship sector that's trying to really revitalize these economies and provide services that have so far not been available.
So I want to ask one more question to take my prerogative here, because in listening to this conversation, I think Lakshman kind of cued on this a little bit. One of the things that we're talking a lot about at the Posner Center now is how we can develop relationships between these social ventures and organizations with the business community. And as Lakshman alluded to, these companies that have grown and have scaled all over the world and that hold a tremendous amount of the wealth in the world. And so we actually have an event on the 26th of February if anybody's interested in coming and learning more about that. But I want to ask you guys, how do you see that all of us working in this social venture kind of startup community can really partner with these pillars of big business around the world to really scale these solutions? I almost wish that Elaine was on this panel as well, because there is this divide between us talking about social entrepreneurship and all these great things that we're doing and the realities of the 99% of the business world out there that is actually working in these developing countries and providing jobs, as I alluded to before. So if anybody has any thoughts
I think it's
on that.
shrinking. I think that 99% might be all the way down to 98.5% by now. There are a couple. First of all, I just want to acknowledge, Professor, that was fantastic. I wrote, took 7 notes on what you said, and I agree with each individual point. And I think there are 6 different topics worth of discussion in there. So yes, thank you very much for that. The notes that I made earlier, very interesting to note that I do think that businesses are getting it. I was fortunate enough to work with Yara, which is a very large Norwegian energy and organization that has a fabulously huge foundation that works extensively with DFID and the others, primarily in Africa. And so there are really great organizations that are putting significant resources into really important pressing issues. So we're seeing that through the foundation tools, and I think that one of the things that we're continuing to learn is that the lines are blurring, right? And that, it is, I actually find now that the large foundations are actually behind the curve of some of the corporate foundations that are able to operate more fluidly and operate between the two organizations. We see a very sort of moderately sized example of that here in Colorado with Rally Software, right? Rally has taken everything they learned from Salesforce and then went to the Salesforce Foundation folks and said, well, what would you do differently now? And they said, oh, well, we wouldn't separate the foundation from the core, just like they separate the asset management from the giving in the foundations. And so they were able to, because they were creating their foundation, they said, well, it's actually integrated, and it's actually a division of Rally that does their Rally for Good work, which is fascinating. The other thing that I've seen is Fast Company, which is not large organizations, but 7 of the Fast 50 that just came out were B Corps. Right? So we're seeing the traction is happening. Mark Benioff, CEO and founder of Salesforce, is joining a growing chorus of publicly traded CEOs who are saying no stakeholder, I think they said, they're pretty much saying stakeholder value is a stupid way to run a business. No, I'm sorry, shareholder value. Sorry, language.
That's the old way. That's the old way, Greg.
No, they're saying the old way, but that's what they're saying. They're saying the shareholder value is a stupid way to run your business, and that you absolutely have to look at all stakeholders in order to decide what to do now. I mean, these are public company CEOs that are under the thumb of the most aggressive market in the world. So those things are definitely changing. The most important thing that I heard, though, which I agree with, and I heard it twice already today, is you have to take into account the market that you're talking about, right? To just send a bunch of money to Zimbabwe, is not going to get to the people, right? Obviously, right? And so you have to be, it is nuanced and sophisticated. One of my partners at the Hub, very active philanthropist and investor in East Africa, primarily through Nairobi, and they're doing a ton of work with the governments and others to not just do skills training, but to do the underlying sort of cultural work. And we see it everything from American ghettos to developing world, where if there's a culture of victimization and fear, one person tries to stand up out of that, and they just get pulled right back down by their cousins and their brothers and their family and their wives. It's not the free flow of ideas that we enjoy here. And so they are really challenging issues, and they're starting to see that places that both large corporations as well as foundations can operate is in some of those underlying issues, so that when they invest in the lighting company, it's moving into a bed of success, potentially.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of kind of social ventures are really focused in places where we can work. Everybody works in Kenya, right?
Right.
There aren't very many social ventures that are popping up in DRC these days.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly jump on something that was just said, which is that I think there's foundations work a lot, obviously, on policy advocacy, and increasingly, and I think there's a way in which social entrepreneurs and the businesses they run can inject a really helpful voice into some of those debates. So and it may be as simple as, for example, gaining a spot at a table that's setting regulations in a certain industry. Often there are spots set aside at those tables for businesses. If a social business can help get a more socially focused advocacy voice at that table and help inject some of that into the conversation, that can be really, really powerful and shouldn't be overlooked. So I think one way that social businesses can help change the way markets operate is through policy, and that is incredibly important and shouldn't be overlooked.
All right, who wants to rough these guys up? Who's got some questions? Right here.
Alan Young here from Ottawa, Canada. I'm interested in the role of failure and the role of risk. You started to touch on it a little bit, and it's come to me. I've been working most of my life within nonprofit sector as a campaigner and things, and we try a lot of stuff fails, and sometimes you win. But more recently, a couple of my colleagues have taken what they say is a page from the social investment world and done failure reports, because we get rewarded for bragging, and this is all the stuff we did right, this is all the stuff we did, but the theory being that we can't afford not to learn all lessons, and we should organize our thinking on our failures, share them openly so other people don't, because we just don't have enough time not to have that learning. And I'm imagining that happens at the Hub and other places, but we recently got a significant grant from somebody who said, you probably have a 50% chance of doing this, but I like the way you're thinking. And I was kind of taken aback by that, but he said, we need to throw more ideas out there, and we need to put fuel in tanks, even though they may go off a cliff.
Yeah, yeah,
So I'm curious, from an entrepreneurial point of view, how do you structure your dialogue around failure? How do you share that?
Well, the first thing is really interesting is I've gotten to know a gentleman who was at Google for a long time, and he was at Google X, and he's very much socially minded, and he's an expert in rapid prototyping. And one of the things that we've learned about the cognitive science behind all that stuff is when we identify something as a failure in our minds, we darken those cells and we don't go back, right? And so we're actually like physiologically attuned to not go revisit failures. So if we say it was a 10% success instead of a 90% failure, then we've got those lessons available to us. So I think part of it is how we relate to risk and failure. First of all, now yes, do people talk about risk? I think very openly, and I think that the vulnerability, especially among my cohort, is a very important conversation that we can move on. I think that we're very fortunate here in the U.S. that we've got a culture where risk and where failure is accepted. You know, in Tokyo, I mean, entrepreneurship is very different in Tokyo. If you fail in the business community in Tokyo, you're ostracized. Like, you don't get a second chance. And I think that's the culture in a lot of places. So very different in different pieces. The other piece about risk, which is very interesting, is we're starting to see foundations and, in some senses, governments start to take that first loss capital. And so what they'll do is they'll de-risk the deal. And they'll take that first loss, and they'll take a lower return because they've got a deal. They can't take high returns, right? And so if you've got a business that's likely to return 5%, if you've got a foundation that'll come in earlier at a higher risk and only take 2%, that now leaves that you can now give 8 or 10% to investors, which is much more friendly. So we're seeing that the capital is actually pretty flexible on some of those risk issues.
I think the international development space is a really interesting space to look at this as well, because I think this concept of failure is much more prevalent in kind of this social venture business world. And you look at a lot of organizations in our building that are in the international development space, and maybe your project fails and maybe you write a report about it back to USAID, but very rarely would you put that up on your website and talk all about how this failed miserably and nobody else should ever try this again. And I think, we need to start doing that. And we've talked about that a lot at the Posner Center, about how we can start storytelling sessions and really, start to get these organizations thinking about that. And especially, we're raising money from lots of individuals. The first thing on your website when you're trying to raise, $50 from 1,000 people, it's not great to have, we just completely blew everybody's money last year because our project didn't work. But that conversation has to be had, because these little organizations keep popping up all over the place, doing the same thing and failing and then disappearing, and then the next year another one pops up. And we just need a lot more conversation around that. Right there. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, there is a group of 1,300 fund managers and investors who represent about 45 trillion, who have signed on to the Principles for Responsible Investment, which is promoting environmental, social, and governance stewardship. Now, there seems to be, to me, a lot of affinity between social entrepreneurship and companies that would sign on to these kinds of principles. Of course, they still have to make, to give some good revenues to those people who invest, whether they be pensioners or any others. But is that a group of investors that you would be inclined to look to? If you've got a company, a social enterprise that's done well, you've got, you want to go up to scale, there's a good market for it, would you go to these companies?
Yes, but the opportunity has to be correct, and it has to be framed correctly. We're always looking to take in more investment because that allows us to scale faster. But if the investors that you partner with are putting certain constraints around your business model that you can't live with, then it's very hard to work with them. So I guess to answer the question, it's just how is that joint venture or that partnership set up, and do your goals ultimately align, both from a social entrepreneurship standpoint, from an impact investing standpoint, and from the end user that you're trying to impact. So it's really just dependent, but if the objectives line up, then absolutely, yes.
And I think just building on that point quickly, I mean, one distinction I see between that effort and this sort of social entrepreneurship or impact investing effort is, and there are a lot of parallels, I agree, is that there's a difference between first do no harm and first do good, which gets put into relief there. I think everyone would want businesses to operate with constraints about what environmental or social risks they're willing to take. And so we absolutely need to get investment managers thinking about those issues, but that may not be enough to get investment capital into businesses that are earning below market returns for the express purposes of doing greater good.
In the back there, far corner.
Thank you. A common element this morning has emerged, I suspect, in the linkage between the moral dimensions and the financial dimensions of decision making. I believe that this link is in the discount rate that we use not only for cost benefit and cost effectiveness analysis, but also for corporate investment. I would like to have guidance on how to think about that. The positive discount rate, greater than zero, makes the future worth less than the present. Most human societies, for the vast majority of our history as a species, have operated on the other principle of a negative discount rate, that our children's well-being is more important than our own. Is there a link here that I am seeing and incorrectly, or is this a path to pursue? Thank you.
Can I try to answer that, not with regard to discount rates, because I think there are more people who can talk about discount rates, but with regard to what you mentioned as the moral dimension, I think it's very important that we recognize a moral dimension or an aspirational norm towards which we are moving as corporations, as philanthropic organizations, businesses. Whatever you do, I think must be look at that vision. And what I would suggest in listening to all these wonderful comments is that I work in a very small area. I'm just a little slither of work where we are focused on the energy poor, the desperately poor. We want to give them appropriate sustainable energy technologies. But in that sphere, if I could draw out the importance of the model vision, people all over the world are looking at problems, and the question is, do they recognize that there are others who are doing the same thing? And I think that is very important, and we've tried to work on this, to have some kind of global repository, a knowledge base where people share their experiences about what they're doing and how they're doing it, why they're doing it, what kind of winds their clock in terms of what they're looking for. And it seems to me, when listening to my panelists here and some questions, that one thing that we can do as academic research institutions is to try and bring together these various threads and create some arena, and I think you guys have started doing this, but others can cooperate to create this place where people who are interested in this kind of investment can go and look and say, there's a fellow out there in Norway who's doing the same thing that I'm doing, and there might be a person actually in South Africa who's doing something like this. That's right. And I think that's a very important facet of forging answers. And whether you want to call it corporate social responsibility, or whether you want to call it morality or aspirational visions, whatever you want to call it, people need to be committed to this space, to this objective, I think, and trying to figure out who else is there.
Just a very quick point on discount rates. I mean, I think discount rates are a very handy tool, obviously, for decision making, and they're especially handy in capturing opportunity costs, and that's part of what their function is, to understand, what would I have to earn in this investment to make it worthwhile. That's the idea of like a hurdle rate, for example, for a discount rate. And I think we're very good, and we've been very well trained, especially investment managers and people who work in finance, to think about financial opportunity costs. What is the Fed funds rate right now, or what is the rate of return of a riskless asset? But we don't ask very well, what is the social good that we're foregoing by making the profit maximizing investment? And so I think I don't know how to roll that all up into one discount rate. I think the more important question is, regardless of whether you use a discount rate or not, that you're asking yourself the question of what the opportunity cost in terms of social good is for one investment versus another.
And I think kind of a corollary on the foundation side, people that are just kind of giving and granting money don't necessarily think about the opportunity costs. Instead of just handing money out, how can I invest in a business? How can I make something more sustainable?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the other piece too, and again, so it's a brilliant question and a very difficult answer. The answer is yes, right? Of course, we need to go back to a negative discount rate, but how to get there, I think, is the real question. And so what's really intriguing to me is as I think that everyone in this room is aware, we've got this like world of high finance, right, that like sits on top of the actual real economy, right? And then we've got this actual real economy that sits on top of the social economy. We've got the social economy that sits on top of the natural economy, right? And so that's the question that we have to answer. And so if the activities of the finance capital, right, are doing long-term damage to the underlying natural and social capital, we've reached the tipping point where there's no second Earth, right? We're done with that whole growth model now. And so ultimately, yeah, like we've created so much, I think, in my own fake wealth, right, through all these financial instruments, and it's now the tail that's wagging the dog. So how to reel that in, I actually don't know. But we do have to. Oh, but apparently Allison does. Phew.
I love the question of my friend in the back row. We've had these conversations for a couple of years now, and same with you, Greg. I mean, it's like every time I come to a talk, Dr. Guruswamy, all of you, Doug, you come so close to individually describing the next steps we need to take. And my fundamental belief is, if not at the University of Colorado Law School, and that just about makes me cry, because I'm taking law classes here now, and I love the students here, and I love the faculty here. And if not, the city of Boulder. Yeah. If we can't do this, you guys, right now, and I want to put some things to you. We're talking about payback, and we're talking about shareholders. But who are the ultimate shareholders? No matter the economy, it is the people that pay for the economy, the taxpayers of that economy. And we talk about impact economies and social economies. We need to figure out how to move into the sharing economy. And we can talk about this more. And I think I'm not talking to the average person in the room, but I am talking to each of you very specifically. There are mechanisms. There are public banking mechanisms. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things that Rockefeller Foundation is so close in part of their Sustainable Communities Initiative to looking at this. And what I would like, before the symposium is over, I would like, and particularly you all, because you've all been leaders that I personally have looked up into in my reclamation work and my municipalization work, regardless if we've been on that side of the issue. A pilot project, maybe we take Cuba. Cuba is the seed for democracy, for restoring the Cuban, the Caribbean oceans, various different types of social investments. I don't know, but can we get together? Can we workshop? Can we take a look at the things that we've talked about here today, public banking, and pulling some sort of a sharing economy conversation together?
All right, I think we are kind of winding up here. Maybe we'll take one more question, and I think people are probably getting hungry and want to go to lunch. So, who else do we have? How about right over here?
Thank you. My name is Susan, and I'm with a small company called The Way to Be that I started. And when I think of the title of this symposium, which is A Bottom-Up World, I can't help but think of your comments and Greg, your reference to noting the culture that we're working with and being culturally empathetic. And so I think that any sustainable innovation has to depend on relationships and the foundation of relationships and the power of relationships. So my question is, how do we create a cultural paradigm shift to value such things, to value a culture of listening, to value a culture of knowing who we're involved with in any project that we're doing, whether it's domestic or international?
Who has the answer to that one?
I'll take a crack at it from the business perspective. You know, something that we find is a huge problem no matter what country we enter is understanding the cultural parameters that exist on the ground. So a lot of what we do is we try to find partners who have been in the local university system, who understand the underlying cultural elements of that particular region or country, such that we know how to go in and frame how to, quite frankly, sell our products. Because, you know, in many of these places, the technology that we introduce is something that they've never seen before. So a lot of, again, what we have to do is pair with different organizations and entities that can go about consumer education, user education on various technologies that could actually be affordable to them, especially when you introduce microfinance institutions and other kind of small-scale financing options to help implement technologies that can really impact the lives of these people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the business perspective is actually really helpful potentially here, where, you know, the history of philanthropic investment, of aid investment, is riddled with instances where programs seemed really great on paper and then they just completely failed when they actually went out into the world. And great businesses understand their users deeply and understand exactly what need they're serving and exactly why that's important and how much they're willing to pay for that. And as that kind of thinking infiltrates aid and philanthropic sectors, which it is increasingly, I think while it's really you know, it's a very simple concept, listening to people, that gets integrated into a lot of jargon like user-centered design. I actually think there's something to that jargon. I think it's important. If that's the way the sector needs to internalize it, so be it. But I think that's what we're starting to see now.
One of the, if I could wrap that into some of the comments we've had, one of the things that's really interesting is, you know, you look at, so you've got Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce, massive multi-billion-dollar corporation. And, you know, one of our members at the Hub is a Salesforce reseller, and they resell Salesforce services into foundations and social enterprises, primarily in the developing world. And they develop things like simple SMS apps that are able to serve the farmer in the field and get that data, can roll back all the way through, hypothetically, like all the way up to the World Health Organization. What's beautiful about that is if Benioff's serious about stakeholder analysis, not just shareholder analysis, and his stakeholders are farmers in Africa, right? We're that much closer to like actually closing that whole chain up and having it be integral to the boardroom conversation at Salesforce. Now, I'm sure that the revenue that they make off of that is a fraction of a percent, but at least it's now like all the pieces just lined up for me, even just on this panel, where it's like, oh no, like Benioff actually has to now take this person into account in a way that he didn't a year ago, is my sense of it. And so I do think that the cultural sensitivity, I mean, I have a lot of challenges with a lot of the travel that we do and the overall environmental cost of that travel, and I have a lot of challenges with the digital technology that we have. But both of those things are drawing our worlds much closer together. And so I think that empathy is, it's harder to avoid. It's harder you don't have boardrooms full of 60-year-old guys the way you used to, right? There are more women, more young people, more millennials that are taking these roles on, and I think the worldview is changing.
Yeah, I was going to say this is a great panel, and we'll wrap it up now. I was going to say we should do this every Friday, and then I kind of looked at you, Greg, and I said, well, we already kind of do.
I was saying we do this every Friday.
You know, definitely, you know, hop on the Impact Hub's website and see what's going on over there. And if you're interested in international development, those types of things, come down to the Posner Center. Again, we have this big kind of business partnerships event on the 26th, and we have these conversations in the hall. And you know, I think the question about how do we connect with other people, I was going to say ping pong and beer. You know, we sit down and we just are all in the same environment talking about this type of stuff every day. So definitely feel free to stop by and certainly visit tenants and certainly stay for the rest of this discussion today and come to other Getch's Wilkinson Center events. So eat lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. All right. Let's scale our lunch back to 50 minutes, and let's come back down here at 1:20, and we'll get started with the afternoon sessions. Lunch is upstairs on the second floor in the student cafeteria, and it's right up the stairway around the corner.